If you enjoy what you hear here today, please consider supporting me on my Patreon page. Every dollar helps, and you get to see content that you won't see here. Chapter 14. The Date, Part 2. Twilight bounced exuberantly as she and Silver surveyed the scene in front of them. The tents, the stands, the costumes, the rides, the decorations, everything that one would find in a holiday fair and more were present. Wizened old ponies were dressed up as ancient wizards from stories, and little foals were dressed up in costumes of imps and angels. They looked around wide-eyed. Twilight turned to Silver excitedly.
Well, what do you think? Cool, huh?
Silver simply nodded. In truth, he was in a little bit of turmoil regarding her choice of location. Silver was hoping, praying even, that she would have picked a quieter, more isolated place to spend their day. Instead, she had brought him to the most populated area of the most populated city in the entire region. Two's company, three's a pain in my flank, he thought to himself. But there was no way that he would voice these thoughts to Twilight. He could plainly see just how excited she was to be here with him, and bursting her bubble would be nothing but cruel. Most definitely, he replied with a small grin. Twilight squeezed slightly before grabbing his foreleg and pulling him into the fray of the crowd. Silver couldn't help but chuckle at her almost fool-like exuberance, and he made a mental note to inquire about it later on when things, hopefully, got quieter. The important part is that I'm spending time with her, he thought, as Twilight continued to drag him through the crowd, milling around them. He had to apologize as he accidentally bumped into Frankenstein's monster, as he let her guide him. Granted, I'd rather not be spending the daytime with hundreds of other ponies at the same time, but I'll take what I can get. Silver hadn't the faintest clue where they were going. He looked behind him and realized that he couldn't see the street that they had entered from. At this point, his life was effectively in her hooves. Where are we going? He asked Twilight, having to speak louder than he normally would due to all the background noise. She turned to him with sparkling eyes and smiled.
To fun,
she replied in a bubbly voice. Silver gave a hearty chuckle as he surrendered himself to her mercy, as she pulled him forward still. He found himself wearing a slight smile as she tightened her grip around his foreleg in an effort to make sure not to lose him. To his surprise, the smile didn't vanish. Fun turned out to be a carnival ride by the name of Fun. That was it, just fun. No fun zone, no fun area, not even fun-splosion, just fun. Silver rolled his eyes in exasperation. This is why the world needs more riders, he thought to himself. This is even worse than that store called Quills and Sofas that sold exclusively quills and sofas. The ride itself was a tall metal contraption with 6 legs sticking out of the top, and on the end of each leg was a platform with 4 seats on it. The central pillar mechanism would turn, and the seating areas would turn with it in the opposite direction as the ride tilted and turned in random directions. All in all, it looked like it would be fun, although with a name like that, it better darn well be. Silver and Twilight got in line, which thankfully wasn't too long since it wasn't yet even 1 p.m. From what he could tell, it would be about 10 minutes, give or take, before they would go on the ride. So in the meantime, Silver decided that he would start a conversation about something that he'd been wondering about since they had arrived at the fairgrounds. So, Twilight, do you often go to the Nightmare Night Fair? Like every year? She replied absent-mindedly as she gazed at the ride in front of them, as it tilted and twirled, sending laughing and screaming ponies flying overhead. From the way her eyes flicked from one part of the giant contraption to the other, Silver thought that she was trying to figure out how it worked. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized that Silver had asked her a question.
Oh no, not every year. I used to, but not anymore.
With a tilt of his head and an inquiring look, Silver asked for details.
I I used to come to the Nightmare Night Fair every year when I was little.
She clarified with a small smile.
I would come with my big brother, and we'd spend the entire day here together.
Her smile widened as she thought back on more.
We'd always dress in the most ridiculous costumes. One time he dressed up as a box of hay fries that you could get at a fast food restaurant, complete with foam fries and everything.
She chuckled.
He even painted his face yellow to go with it.
She sighed wistfully.
He'd let me stand on his back, and he'd compete to see how many of a certain costume we could find, like Vampony or Zombie. The one who could find the most costumes had to buy ice cream for the both of us.
That's sweet, Silver said with a smile.
Yeah, though in the end, he would always end up buying the ice cream no matter who won.
With one final chuckle, Twilight turned to Silver to satisfy her own curiosities.
What about you?
She asked him.
Have you ever been to the Nightmare Night Fair?
He grimaced. Once, when I was very young. I didn't enjoy it very much, though, as I was too busy either running away from all of the monsters or challenging them to noble duels to defend my parents. A brief memory of a much younger Silver Quill passed through his mind. He had pounced on the head of a pony dressed as a dragon who had leaned a little too far down to speak to him. He had his forehooves around the beast's neck and was biting at its ear while yelling, "You're not allowed to eat my mommy!" He could almost remember his father's face and how it was twisted in horror, while his mother was doubled over in laughter. He relayed this memory to Twilight, and she chuckled.
Aw, Mommy's little knight. How adorable.
She cooed, and Silver's cheeks reddened slightly in embarrassment. Well, I still say that the dragon was a little too lifelike, so it's hardly my fault if I reacted accordingly, he huffed. Twilight's chuckling turned into uproarious laughter. After a few moments of indignation, Silver eventually smirked in his own amusement. So yeah, I always did have a really active imagination, he continued. My parents were kind of hesitant to bring me to the fair after that, and for good reason. With more snickering on her part, Twilight nodded.
I'll say, you must have been an adorable child with such an imagination.
Another flashback assaulted his mind at those words. He remembered the time when he first met Twilight Sparkle those many years ago, with her straight mane, big eyes, and book bag weighed down with paperbacks. I don't think I was the adorable one back then, he thought to himself. Maybe I'll tell her about that encounter later today. There wouldn't really be any point, as there was no chance that she would remember him, but she might find it interesting. Maybe. Their conversation was interrupted as the line they were standing in moved forward, letting them board the ride. Silver sat next to Twilight in one of the platforms, and two other seats across from them were occupied by two stallions, one Earth Pony and one Pegasus. Once every pony had strapped themselves in with a combination of harnesses and safety bars, the attendee ignited her horn and started up the ride. Silver's stomach dropped as the ride quickly lifted them into the air. When was the last time I've been on one of these rides? He thought to himself. Oh, right. Never. The last time he'd been to the fair with his parents, he hadn't been tall enough to go on any of the rides. Growing up, he hadn't had much of a fascination for amusement parks and such. Well, there's a first for everything, he thought before being quickly whisked away as the platform started to fly through the air, leaving his thoughts well and truly behind as he screamed and held onto the safety bar for dear life. With unsteady legs, Twilight and Silver left their seats after the ride had ended, and made their way to the gate in the fence separating the ride and the rest of the fair. Twilight was giggling quietly, still caught up in the euphoria and the adrenaline from being whipped around the air like a doll in the hooves of a baby. Silver Quill was starting to regret having such a large breakfast as he followed her.
That was fun,
she chirped in between giggles. Silver nodded uncertainly. It was certainly something, The ride was a full few minutes of dizzying vertigo and colors flying faster than the eye could keep track of. To his inexperienced stomach, it was akin to being caught in the center of a hurricane. Twilight had already recovered from the ride and was eagerly looking around for their next destination.
What would you like to do now?
She asked him. You know what? How about we just sit down for a minute? Or 10. I just need to let my stomach settle. He answered woozily. Blinking in surprise, Twilight looked at him with worry.
Oh, are you alright? Was it too much?
She guided him over to a wooden bench, and they sat down. I'm fine, he reassured her, albeit a little weakly. I'm just not used to rides like that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I should have realized. I just assumed that you would have had fun with it and...
She sighed dejectedly.
And I really should have reread that how-to guide for dating before we left.
Silver draped a foreleg around her shoulders and pulled her closer for a reassuring squeeze. Don't worry about it, Twilight, it's fine. Let's just go on some of the easier rides first, so I don't lose my breakfast. She smiled up at him.
Sure. What do you want to do?
He shrugged. I don't really know. How about you decide? Twilight looked down at her hooves briefly before responding.
We could go on the merry-go-round?
Silver chuckled weakly. Oh, come on. I'm not that delicate. Twilight grinned sheepishly.
Sorry.
She sat for a few more moments, tapping her hoof to her chin in contemplation. Finally, she brightened up.
I know. Let's go to the bumper carts.
The two of them made their way to bumper carts, a carnival favorite. Instead of Twilight dragging Silver by the hoof, they walked leisurely through the fairgrounds, Twilight leading the way and Silver following as they took in the sights. The next few hours were spent with Twilight showing Silver what the fair had to offer. She had the entire layout committed to memory, no doubt from all the time she had been there with her brother. They went on several more rides that were a little bit easier for Silver to handle, and they played some of the games that were set up by the carnies. Silver managed to win a small plushie of a van pony in the dart toss, which he gave to Twilight, much to her pleasure. They were walking along when they were interrupted from a voice that came from behind them. Silverquill? Is that you? The pair turned around to see a unicorn stallion quickly trotting up to them, though neither Silver or Twilight could tell what he looked like because his entire body was wrapped with what looked like toilet paper for what had to be a mummy costume. The pony bounded up to the two of them and stood right in front of Silver. He didn't know who the pony was underneath the paper, but he could see that the eyes that were visible were twinkling with excitement. Holy hey, it is you! It's been like years since I've seen you last. Silver looked at the newcomer with confusion. I'm sorry, but I don't know if I remember you from wherever it is you remember me from. The mystery pony's eyes widened. Oh, right, my costume. The pony reached up and moved away some of the white wrappings that were covering his head to reveal a skinny stallion with a pale green coat and a slicked back golden mane. It's me, dude, Trailblazer. The stallion leaned in and elbowed Silver on his chest with a smirk. Don't tell me you don't remember me. Silver's eyes widened with realization as he was assaulted with memories of school days. He remembered sitting quietly on a bench outside of his school as a young stallion, and he remembered a lanky teenager walking over and sitting next to him with a wide grin. Hi, I'm Trailblazer. The younger Silverquill hadn't responded, so the lanky teenager with the slicked back mane continued. I just moved here from Baltimore because my dad's work reassigned him to Canterlot first year here. When he hadn't a response from the baffled bibliophile sitting next to him, he kept on talking. And I have good news. I just decided that you're gonna be my new and first friend in Canterlot. What do you have to say about that? Silver looked up at the green pony for a few moments before shrugging and saying, okay. and from that moment onwards, they'd become good buddies. Silver had shown Trailblazer around the school grounds and the city, and Trailblazer entertained Silver with stories from his life in Baltimore. Sure, it was a strange way to start a friendship, but considering how difficult it could be to make friends, Silver appreciated how easily this friend had been made. They had went their separate ways after they had left Celestia's school for gifted unicorns, Silver going on to write for a living and Trail going to pursue a career in professional hoofball, a game that he had been extremely good at back in school. Their career goals ultimately ended up with them living on completely opposite sides of the city, and they naturally drifted apart as a result. Once Silver realized who he was talking to, he smiled. "Blazer! It's good to see you, old buddy," he said as he clapped his friend on the shoulder enthusiastically. Trailblazer grinned. "There you go. I knew you couldn't have forgotten me," he said happily. "How have you been, Featherflank?" Silver rolled his eyes as his old nickname, derived from his Quill cutie mark, was said, and Twilight couldn't help but giggle at its mentioning. He groaned instantly, knowing that there was no way that name wasn't going to come back and bite him in the feathered flank later on. Silver was about to answer, but Trailblazer's green hoof covered his mouth before he could reply. Twilight snickering at the nickname he had called Silverquill drew his attention, and Silver knew that Blazer was nothing if not a self-proclaimed lady stallion. Trailblazer quickly walked past Silver and presented himself to Twilight with his head held high and his chest puffed out like an overconfident pigeon. "Why, hello there," he said with a waggle of his eyebrows, sending Twilight into another giggle fit, this time with a blush on her face. "And who might you be?" he asked her. Silver face-huffed as Twilight smiled politely back at him. Trailblazer always did think that he had a way with the mares, and his incessant flirting had been quite the annoyance when they were young. Given his track record with mares, however, Silver wasn't too worried.
"My name is Twilight Sparkle. It's a pleasure to meet you,"
she said pleasantly. Blazer gave her a toothy grin. "Well, Twilight, I absolutely have to know." He leaned forward slightly and winked at her. "What's a pretty mare like you doing here with a dork like him?" He finished as he jabbed a hoof over his shoulder, indicating Silverquill, who was standing behind him with a cross expression on his face. With more giggling, Twilight shot Silver a smirk before replying. Ah, yes, he was going to hear of this later on.
"I'm on a date,"
she said simply. Had to resist a chuckle as he saw Trailblazer almost deflate in disappointment. "Ah, is that so? In that case, where's the lucky stallion?" he questioned. Silver noticed Twilight's side shaking as she tried to resist the urge to laugh, and he then decided that enough was enough. He reached over and tapped Trailblazer on the shoulder as he made a small noise. Blazer briefly looked over his shoulder irritably as he shooed away the offending hoof. Yeah, hold on a minute, Featherflank. I'm having a conversation here." Typical. Not even his old friend could dissuade him from making a fool out of himself in front of every mare he crossed paths with. Silver stood behind Trailblazer with a scowl on his face. The overconfident pony turned back to Twilight, but was surprised when she burst out into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. He looked at her in confusion for a moment, before it started to dawn on him. "Wait a minute," he said slowly as he gradually looked over his shoulder at a rather irate-looking Silverquill. Blazer didn't even say anything. He just pointed at him with a weak hoof, and Silver nodded pointedly. A smile grew on his face. "Oh, you gotta be kidding me." He turned back to Twilight with a baffled expression on his face. "A mare like you with a guy like him?" He shook his head in mock despair. "It must be a sign. The end times are upon us." With a sigh and a shake of his head, Silver walked up to his old friend and looked him dead in the eye. "It seems that 3 years hasn't done much to change you, has it, Blazer?" The mummified pony only laughed and shook his head with a proud expression on his face. "Nope. And be honest, Featherflank." He leaned in closer to Silver and winked suggestively at him. "You wouldn't have it any other way." Silver grinned. Nor would I expect it to be. Good answer. Trail chuckled as he slapped Silver on the back. He then took a few steps back and smiled at the two of them. All right, I'm gonna get out of your manes and let you two go back to making kissy faces at each other or whatever it is you were doing. He gave a polite bow to Twilight. It was a pleasure to meet you, madam.
Oh, believe me,
Twilight said with a smirk flickered over to Silver Quill.
the pleasure was all mine.
Be seeing you, Featherflank, and do me a favor and tell your dad I said hi, would ya? Silver nodded, but Trailblazer had already run off. He never was able to stay in one place for too long, Silver knew. He was almost flattered that his old friend had actually managed to stand still for a few minutes just to have a friendly conversation with him. Silver turned back to Twilight to see her staring at him with her hoof covering her mouth as she shook slightly. With a sigh, Silver shook his head in defeat. Oh, go on then, let it out.
Featherflank!
She managed to gasp out before falling into hysterics over the newly discovered nickname.
That is just too funny.
She wheezed in between laughs. He couldn't help but roll his eyes. Yeah, go ahead and laugh at me. It's all right. I don't mind, he said sarcastically.
All right. Whew.
Twilight said breathlessly. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath.
I'm good.
She said as she opened her eyes to see him looking at her with a raised eyebrow. Glad to hear it, he replied. Now, I believe we were heading somewhere? Twilight nodded.
Right.
She said as she waved her hoof and took off in the direction that they had been walking before they had been interrupted.
Follow me, Featherflank,
She ordered with a small smirk. Silver groaned as he matched his step with hers. No good could come out of this, he knew. The remainder of the day passed blissfully uninterrupted. Silver and Twilight had spent the rest of their time going to rides, playing games, and looking at the attractions of the fair. The most popular of which was the haunted house, which Twilight insisted that they go in. It was a large building that could be disassembled and reassembled easily, that had been decorated with all sorts of spooky imagery, ranging from huge hairy spiders to wrinkly one-eyed witches. They walked through the rooms of the house, occasionally getting startled when a screaming noise suddenly pierced the air, or when an actor jumped out at them from behind a wall while revving a fake chainsaw. But even the rides, games, and miscellaneous attractions were second-rate compared to the joy that the two felt just by being together. From the most light-hearted to the most introspective conversation, from every casual touch or glance, from every scream of shock or cry of laughter, the two ponies were enjoying each other's company more than anything else that the fair could throw at them. Unfortunately, while both ponies were fully aware of how happy they were themselves, just being in the presence of the other, neither were able to speak their feelings, nor were they able to realize that the other felt the same way. Both of them were woefully inexperienced when it came to matters of the heart, and it showed. Silverquill felt a happiness that he hadn't felt in years, if ever. The simple sight of the lavender mare sitting across from him, or the reassuring presence as she walked beside him, made him feel as though he were one of the luckiest stallions in Equestria. He found himself thanking the stars for whatever it was that possessed him to so abruptly ask Twilight out that morning. Unfortunately, he had no idea if Twilight felt the same way about him. Were she any other mare, although the reason that she wasn't was partly why Silver liked her so much, he would have been able to figure her out in an instant. But still, his uncanny abilities to read the emotions of other ponies like an open book were thwarted by the mare no matter how hard he tried. Twilight's thoughts and feelings, meanwhile, mirrored Silver's to an almost startling degree. To her, it was more than just a companionship that he offered, or the similar interests that they had. The way he looked at her so intensely, like she was the most important pony in the world. The way he never wasted words, preferring to listen instead of talk, which resulted in him being unnaturally wise for his age. They all appeared to her in a way she could barely understand. Twilight's mind was a naturally hyper one, always eager to learn and discover. Sometimes, though, her mind could get away from her, making her do things she wouldn't normally dream of doing, like enchanting a doll with a very potent attraction spell and letting it loose amongst the town's ponies. Silverquill's stoicism and wisdom to her was, in a word, stabilizing. He felt like a pony that she would be able to turn to and lean on no matter how rough things got for her. But it was a little more than that, too. The only way she could describe it was when she would settle down with one of her oldest and dearest books for a night. It was like that. The comfort and excitement that was nearly identical with how she was feeling around Silver now. If only she was able to figure out how he felt about her, then maybe she would know what to do next. Although, knowing him, she'd have better luck trying to get Pinkie Pie to give up partying, or get Rainbow Dash to give up on flying. And so, as the day went on and gradually turned into night, the two ponies who enjoyed each other's company more than any other spent their time talking, laughing, and enjoying themselves. But above all, they spent their time wondering what the future had in store for them. Silver and Twilight slowly ambled through the fairgrounds. It was late in the evening, and most of the ponies had left, so they didn't have to worry so much about watching where they were going so that they didn't bump into any pony. The sun was beginning to set beyond the many buildings that surrounded the open grassy area that the fair had been erected on, bathing the clouds in peach-tinted light. Twilight scrutinized the clouds above them as they let themselves be taken wherever their host took them.
Looks like the fair will be closing soon.
She looked at Silverquill.
We'll probably only have enough time for one more ride.
All right, he said slightly wearily. His stomach had taken enough of a beating today with the twists and turns and tilts and tumbles, as Twilight had eagerly taken him from one ride to the next. Combined with that, the exorbitant amount of cotton candy he had eaten, and he wasn't sure his poor little stomach could handle it. Twilight must have noticed that he was looking a little green, and she smiled at him reassuringly.
Don't worry, we're not going on anything too strenuous this time.
He gave a small sigh of relief. It looked like that cotton candy was going to be staying right where it was.
In fact,
Twilight continued, speaking with a grin,
I think I know the perfect place to end the day.
And where would that be? Silver asked curiously. Twilight pointed excitedly at what must have been the largest ride in the entire fairgrounds, visible in the sky even though it was on the opposite side. Silver smiled. A very good choice, he said before the two of them trotted off, walking in between carnival booths and carefully avoiding stepping on the litter that was scattered across the ground. The Ferris wheel towered above the two ponies as they approached it. To Silver's surprise, there was a small lineup of ponies waiting for it to finish unloading its passengers in its last revolution, so that they could see what the world looked like from a bird's eye view. This had to be the most populated spot in the fair right now, although it made sense for it to be so. The moments before sunset, he figured, were probably the most radiant to be seen from 30 feet in the air. Once the last passenger disembarked from the last occupied seating platform, a young bronze earth pony stallion with long brown dreadlocks exited the operator's booth and stood in front of the line of awaiting ponies. "All right, every pony," he said loudly with a cheeky grin. "This is going to be our last spin for the day. Now, it's important to not shake the seat too much, and remember, no food or drinks are allowed on the ride." The grin turned into a suggestive smile as his gaze traveled from one waiting pony to another. "However, A little high-altitude smooching is allowed and strongly encouraged. Silver blinked incredulously as the small crowd was overcome with a bout of whispers and giggles. It was only then that he noticed that most of the ponies around them were standing very close to another pony, close enough that their relationship appeared to be more than purely platonic. It seemed that Twilight wasn't the only one that thought that a spin on the Ferris wheel would be a nice and maybe even romantic way to end a date. Silver coughed awkwardly as he thought about what the stallion said, and he pointedly avoided looking at Twilight, who he noticed did the same with him. The bronze pony with the dreadlocks started to usher the crowd one by one into the empty seats as the wheel slowly began to turn, probably being controlled by another pony sitting in the operator's booth. He helped the ponies strap themselves down and made sure that the safety bar was secure across their bodies, quickly moving from one seat to another. Twilight and Silver's turn came soon enough. The stallion ushered them in and quickly strapped them down. He gave them a quick wink and a smile as he finished. "Not too much funny stuff up there, eh?" he said as he waggled his eyebrows at them. Twilight looked away as she blushed, and Silver merely shot him an annoyed look. The bronze stallion only responded with a laugh. "All right, get her going," he called to the pony sitting in the operator's booth. The wheel hummed and jerked to life, and Silver and Twilight slowly started to ascend. The wheels spun in short, slow intervals, allowing every pony to appreciate the view from up high as the bottom seats got higher and the top seats got lower. It took about 5 minutes of slowly rotating for Silver and Twilight to reach the top of the wheel, and they gazed at the impressive display before them. The sky, tinged pink and orange, with only the barest tints of blue left, sprawled across the distance before them. The sun, now only half visible as it dipped its head below the horizon, was bright and golden, but not so bright that it couldn't be looked at with too much discomfort. The glow bounced off of the rooftops of Canterlot, giving everything the illusion of being made of gold. Twilight sighed from where she sat directly beside Silver, drawing his attention to her. Suddenly, the sun lost all meaning to him. Her lips were turned into a small, content smile as she took in the scenery. Truly, it was beautiful. The warm colors, the light breeze that sent the stray leaves tumbling, the glowing treetops. Everything looked as though it could be the picture on a postcard. None of it, however, could be compared to the beauty that was the one sitting beside him. Twilight noticed him looking at her, and she turned to meet his eyes. He didn't say anything. Instead, he just greedily drank in the sight, like a pony finding water for the first time in months. After a few moments, she looked away awkwardly.
I think...
she muttered uncertainly, looking down to the side before meeting Silver's eyes again.
I think I remember reading that this is the part of the date where...
She blushed as she trailed off, flustered. She shook her head thoroughly before continuing quietly.
Where we're supposed to kiss.
Silver's eyes widened, but not in surprise. Didn't surprise him at all that Twilight, practical, organized Twilight, would want to stick to the rules of a proper date set down by an official rulebook. He was struck, however, by the implication that she had just dropped on him. The only thing he could do was nod, dumbly, not breaking eye contact with her. Twilight looked at him shyly before she closed her eyes and leaned in towards him, a serene yet nervous expression on her face. Silver's mind was in turmoil. Waves of raw emotion, now released like a raging river behind a dam that just broke, crashed against his mental barriers. Fear, happiness, nervousness, excitement, and everything in between intermingled until they had fused so much together that they turned into something that didn't even have a name. Only one rational thought, or at least a shadow of a thought, managed to reach Silver's mind. He realized that he needed to do something that would probably be very difficult, but something that was necessary. He took a deep breath and prepared himself. Wait. His voice cut in quietly. Twilight opened her eyes and looked at him curiously. I think that maybe we should take things a little bit slower, he said. Twilight cocked her head in confusion but didn't say a word. I really like you, Twilight, Silver said, trying to put as much force and meaning behind the words as possible. But I think that it would be best if we did this one step at a time, for the sake of our relationship. Twilight was slightly taken aback by the unusual show of emotion. His words were laced with sincerity, and she couldn't help but feel confused. Dates, romance, stallions, and everything in between were uncharted territory for her, so she didn't know what to think. She decided to trust him, however.
Okay,
she said simply.
My book never did say when the first kiss had to happen, so I guess that's alright.
Silver almost laughed, but instead he just nodded at her. Twilight looked away from him, and he looked away from her as a brief pause in the Ferris wheel's rotation stopped, and it started moving again. After a moment, however, she leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder.
Is this okay?
She asked him. Silver trembled slightly at the contact. This is fine, he replied with a gentle smile to her. She nodded and fidgeted in her seat, getting a bit more comfortable. They sat in silence for a few more moments, enjoying the sight as the wheel gradually brought them closer to the ground.
Featherflank?
Yeah?
I really like you too.
The ride didn't last much longer. Or at least that's how it seemed to Silver, with the way Twilight was so close to him with her head on his shoulder. Once they disembarked, Twilight shortly teleported the two of them back to Ponyville, where they made their way back to the library. The two of them were quite tired after their busy day and were eager to get intimately reacquainted with their beds. Spike was sleeping on the couch when they arrived, something that didn't surprise Twilight at all. They bade each other a good night, and they went into their separate rooms. Sleep was elusive for Silverquill. Thoughts of the day raced back and forth through his mind, mainly concerning what happened on the Ferris wheel. He couldn't help but think about Twilight's words, her shy, quiet confession of her feelings for him. He felt a small, gnawing pit of excitement in his stomach as he replayed those words over and over and over in his mind.
I really like you too.
Such a simple sentence, but one that meant so much. Eventually, with one more happy sigh, he started to drift off to sleep, and most likely to dreams of dark forests and glowing ponds. Not to be disappointed by his subconscious, Silver's dreams were almost the exact same as always. He ran through a forest, leaves getting tangled in his mane, thin branches clawing at his face, and above all, fear coursing through his veins. The fear vanished, however, as he broke through a wall of foliage and was met with a familiar sight. Purple and white flowers, long grass, and a pond beneath an old weeping willow met him. All familiar and completely safe. He quickly realized that he wasn't alone. Near the pond, a tall and slender silhouette of a pony blanketed in shadow was sitting with its back to him, looking down into the depths of the pond before it. Before Silver could move or say anything, it turned to look at him.
Greetings, young Silverquill,
it said with a smile.
We are pleased to see thou could make it.